In the wake of both me publishing on abortion in Aereo, I think in 2019 it was, so I think 3 years ago, and in the wake of our talking about this issue in early May, about 2 months ago, we got a lot of very good responses, but I also got some pushback from what I view as extremists on one side. I got called a baby killer, right? And I'm very clear in the Aereo piece that while I have never had to make the choice, I was never in a position. I was some combination of skillful and lucky enough never to have been in a position to have made a choice, but I am good friends with people who have. And what I haven't said publicly, and I have asked him if I may talk about this, and he has said yes, is that my beloved younger brother is adopted. And when we talk to each other, we don't refer to him as my adopted brother, and I don't usually introduce him, in absentia to people as my adopted brother, although sometimes it's relevant. But he's my brother. He was adopted. He was born to a teenage mother somewhere in the middle of the country, who loved their daughter, and who loved their daughter sufficiently and had means sufficient, and had values consistent with having her take the baby to term, but then immediately give that child up for adoption. She had been in a relationship with a dude some years older than her, classic story, right? Like very good girl in a good family who got impregnated by a guy who had no business anywhere near her. And the family didn't believe in abortion, and she carried to term, and my parents adopted my brother within a day or two of his birth and brought him home, and he was my brother from then on. And I have always, and my brother has always, been grateful that family made the decision that they did, and that I have a brother, right? And that he has the family that he has. He, like me, is pro-choice, and he always has been. And this is not an inconsistency. This doesn't say anything about him wishing that he didn't exist, him wishing that he himself had been aborted, which would have been an easier choice at some level for that young 15 or 16-year-old back in the early 70s, just slightly after Roe was even made it possible. We can be grateful for that particular choice that was made, and also grateful that it was a choice. Grateful for the human being that exists and is my brother and is my children's uncle, and also grateful that that girl, as have generations of girls since then, had the option to have safe and legal abortions should they so choose. This is not an inconsistency. And I guess that's it. At this point, I will just keep repeating the same thing, but it's not. I think people want to trot out examples like Beethoven would have been aborted, right? Right.
But you can't do this. We have to have an adult conversation, and the adult conversation does not involve us breaking down into a puddle of sorrow for all of the sperm that might have met an egg that would have been someone great that would have changed the world. Right. That's not how it works, yeah. Right? The fact is, people come into being, circumstances affect them, they become what they are, and looking back at an individual life and saying, well, what if a different choice had been made, it's sleight of hand, right?
I think it is. I'm not sure I could defend that, though. I think you're right. It feels like sleight of hand. It feels like there's no obligation to say any of this, which is part of why I haven't said it before.
No, it's sleight of hand because the number of people who might have been, but for all sorts of things, right, including just sperm barely having missed egg, or having been a fraction of a second later to an egg than some other sperm. Or the point is, do you want to do all those calculations about what might have been? Your brain will hang up at the sheer complexity of the calculation. It does not result in a coherent understanding of an alternative world. Or do you want to be selective and say, oh, well, would you have that person not exist? right? It's one or the other. Either you want to understand everything that might have been, in which case you're going to be reduced to ignoring this by virtue of the fact that what you take to be important will be lost in a sea of other things that might be equally important or more so, right? Or you want to say those who are here are a different matter than the thing that resulted in them being here, right? Do you want, if somebody missed the bus and didn't get to a date that would have resulted in an important person having been born who we will never even know of because the date didn't occur, right? Like, that's not a tragedy, right? It may in fact be a major loss to humanity that a person didn't come into being as a result of a missed bus, but there's no way to calculate it honorably, right?
Yeah. Well, and I think this is actually another example of the rise of the import of calculation and quantitative analysis of human experience over actually recognizing how diverse and complex we are, right? Like, okay, can you calculate that? Well, then let's ignore all of the things that we can't calculate. Let's ignore the qualifiable and focus only on the quantifiable. And probably also put our biases in there, because once we, fill the quantifiable with enough black boxes, it becomes hard for anyone else to come in and figure out what's been done. And once there is a thing to be counted, it's easier to point to that and say that thing is precious than to say, oh, there was never a thing. Therefore, of course, there was no preciousness there to begin with.
Yeah, I mean, it's another version of owning the downsides of your own arguments, right? If we're going to look at somebody who does exist and say they might not have, the point is that same calculation results in all sorts of people who didn't exist, but for a thousand things. So, it's cheating at one level to drag that in. I would also say this is a question about which kinds of calculations you want to do, right? A simple calculation about, you do or you don't have this right and it's absolute or it isn't is absurd. The fact is, trying to maximize anything is devastating in any complex system. And so trying to maximize or minimize this right is a problem. And there's a reason that other parts of the world don't typically do that. There are some that do, but, Europe, for example, has, they've found a balance point in general. And
it's widely variable. I mean, the different nation states in Europe have different numbers of weeks, usually, before and after which abortion is legal. After which sometimes it might be legal in the case of saving the mother's life, for instance. But in some of the countries that we in America who are pro-choice have historically liked to trot out as evidence of having full reproductive rights, actually have fairly restricted numbers. Some of these are at the end of the first trimester or earlier, which is well before a lot of genetic testing can happen, and it feels. That would be a restrictive step back for the majority of Americans who live in states where the state law is still protecting abortion at more or less the same level as it did a few days ago.
Yeah. And I do think it belongs somewhere in this conversation. There is certainly talk in states that are eager to obliterate this right. Yeah. There is talk about preventing people from, for example, crossing a state boundary to seek an abortion, which I would be shocked if such provisions stood up to a challenge in the court, because of course you have a constitutional right to move between states. Right. And so in any case, I do think we are headed towards a world in which there will be differential access in different states, which is one reason that a federal policy might find itself on more solid legal ground, right? Equal protection might involve people in all states having equal rights to procedures like this. I don't know, but that is at least discussed as one possible basis for replacement for Roe. But where we are headed, short of something like a federal provision that did protect this as a matter of equal protection under the law, we are headed for a world in which it is vastly more inconvenient for people living in some states than others, which, does seem unfair to me. It does seem
unfair. And there's also been wildly unequal access for a while now, even with Roe standing.
That's true.
That doesn't make it okay. That does not make it okay. But that
Yeah,
I mean, we will see what happens next. Obviously, it's not heartening. It felt like a very sad day. It also was. We all knew it was coming, and as we said in episode 125, there are legal scholars on both sides of this issue who really feel very strongly, for instance, that women ought to have the right to choose, who feel that Roe was bad law.
Yeah. Well, it'll be very interesting to see where we go. I do hope that one thing that comes out of it is that we have a more nuanced conversation about, what sex ought to be with respect to how we understand each other. And I hope that we move in the direction of taking it much more seriously and honoring it rather than trivializing it. I guess I would also, this is more at home a while back in the conversation, but I also think that in that discussion, we really increasingly need to draw a distinction between collaborative sex and antagonistic sex, and realize that what we are doing, that the free-for-all has actually moved us in the direction of a mode of sex where there's no intent. Men have no intent to invest at all in the people with whom they are having sex, that cannot help but echo what in the past would have been an antagonistic version of sex. The idea of impregnating somebody and walking away is not a kind thing, right? It's not something a decent person should want to do. And the fact that we are now pretending that this is a commonplace behavior and that we should all want this, men and women should want to be having sex and not thinking about commitment, it's not clear that makes anybody happier or more satisfied. And B, it's not clear that we should want a society in which that's the way people behave.
Well, it is, as we have said elsewhere, including in our book at some length, it is upholding men at their worst as the ideal to which we should all aspire.
Yeah.
As if men at their worst should be the ideal to which any of us should aspire. Women at their worst, similarly, it's just... this happens to be a men at their worst thing.
Yep.
And women and, good men or men who would only very occasionally consider going to their worst mode are all like, okay, well, it's a free for all. So I guess let's do this. And it doesn't leave people joyous, satisfied, sexually or otherwise, or in good shape with regard to the rest of their lives.